Today I have for you what combat sports is all about, and that's the ability to repeat high-intensity efforts repeatedly, round after round, fight after fight. When we define repeated high-intensity efforts, it is hard maximal or near maximal efforts repeated with short rests between. For example, scrambling and wrestling or MMA, it could be throwing a flurry of punches in boxing, and it's the ability to maintain a certain level of power output over the course of a round, a fight, or whatever that is. So this particular video dives into the concept of high volume power training. Now, I recently published a blog post on the Sweet Science of Fighting website. The link is in the description. And it goes through the detail and the research behind high volume power training and the importance of repeated high intensity efforts. That's what these acronyms taught me. To illustrate the importance of this repeated high intensity efforts, I've listed some of the typical activity to break ratios within a few of the popular combat sports, and then listed on the far right there, the number of seconds high intensity efforts within those work periods generally sits on average. So for example, with an MMA, we have a 1:2 to 1:4 activity to break ratio or work to rest ratio within the sport. And within these work ratios here, approximately 8 to 14 seconds is seen as the high intensity activity. And the UFCPI have done some great analysis, and they deciphered that 77% of MMA fights in the UFC are ended within these 8 to 14 second bursts of high intensity activity. We can go to kickboxing. We have a similar activity to break ratio, but their high intensity effort period is around 2 seconds. This obviously depends on the style of kickboxing that is being performed, but regardless, we see around a 2 second high intensity period. Jiu-jitsu, a 6:1 activity to break ratio, a 2 to 4 second high intensity period. Judo, 2:1 to 3:1, and we have a shorter 1 to 1.7 second. This is typically when there's throws, but also there's high intensity efforts on the ground. Add another 9 to 20 odd seconds on top of that, depending. But I didn't add the groundwork because the groundwork can be lower or higher intensity depending on what's happening. And the same thing with wrestling, 2.5 to 1 activity to break ratio. This is just the activity number in seconds on average, so 27 to 47 seconds. We don't know how much of that time is spent doing high intensity activity, but if you've ever wrestled, you know that a lot of that probably is done at a high intensity. Now, as you can see, the importance within combat sports to be able to repeat these is these numbers here is where a lot of the action is happening, and you want to be able to maximize outputs within these very small windows of high intensity activity within a fight. So to understand how we're going to train to improve the ability to repeat high intensity efforts, we need to understand the factors that underpin this quality. Now, as with most things, the aerobic energy system or aerobic development sets that base. It helps you recover faster between high intensity efforts, but only to some extent. Now, regarding the threshold for aerobic development, it seems to be within the research, 4.7 meters per second for your maximal aerobic speed. Now, that sounds like gibberish to you. Very simple test. If you do a 5 or 6 minute row or bike or run, and you take that distance and you divide it by the time in seconds, you will get a number in meters per second, and that is your maximal aerobic speed. 4.7 is relatively high. Most trained people can get there, though, relatively easy. Now, some of the issues within the literature is most of the research on high intensity efforts is done in repeat sprint ability studies, so mainly within team sports like soccer, rugby, etc. And there are conflicting findings within the research as it depends on the sprint protocol they used. For example, how far they sprinted, how long they rested, how many sprints they did. A lot of the times, subjects save themselves for future sprints, so they don't go 100% on the first sprint, which kind of skews the data and defeats the purpose of repeat sprint ability. And the other thing is they don't involve other movements that combat sports would involve. Things like having to throw punches, take shots, wrestle, grapple, all of that as well. So in the end, we see a very poor relationship or poor correlation between repeated sprint ability and repeated high intensity efforts. I kind of did a little illustration here to show you this very small overlap. And there's one really good study that shows this in action. So this study was within rugby league, and rugby league, I always say all the time, rugby is relatively close to combat sports in terms of the demands of the game. Obviously, you need to be able to run within rugby league, but you also need to be able to tackle repeatedly throughout a match. Now, what they did is they used GPS, and they used that to isolate collisions from running within a repeated high-intensity effort test. And what they found was there's a 14% greater reduction in collision performance versus running, which means that activities outside of running that involve manipulating another human, grappling, tackling, whatever that is, suffer more under these high intensity efforts than something like running. Which means while aerobic development may underpin a lot of repeated sprint ability, we need to develop high levels of power output. We need to be able to sustain that repeatedly throughout a fight. So one way to develop this ability to repeat high intensity efforts is high volume power training. Now, high volume power training isn't a very well-known training modality. It got put on to me by Alex Natera. He did a very good review of this method, and he has some great protocols that he has published as well, which I'll share with you, and things that I've used as well, and I've modified them further. They're inside the Sweet Science of Fighting Underground as part of the 365 striking, grappling, and MMA training programs. But some general rules for high volume power training: 10 to 15 reps per set, multiple sets up to 300 reps. Honestly, even over 100 reps for me within a session absolutely kills me. 30 to 120 seconds rest between those sets. Using big movements, for me, squat jump with the bar on the back or trap bar jump would be my go-tos. And then 30 to 50% 1RM. Usually you're looking for loads that optimize peak power. So within the jump squat, anywhere between 30 to 40% 1RM. I stick to the lower end, around 30 or sometimes even a little under, especially if you're not used to these movements. It is brutal. Even the first week you do it, you will be wiped out, and it doesn't get any better as you go through the cycle. But the ability to sustain power outputs and simultaneously improve maximal power through this method, there's no other method that will do that. Further, you develop cardiovascular and neuromuscular adaptations doing one exercise. Typically, you isolate those to improve various physical capabilities. For example, you might do steady state cardio or high intensity interval training to hit the cardiovascular side, and you might do power training within the gym, Olympic lifting, jumps, etc. for the neuromuscular side. This tackles both simultaneously. So here's a simple 3-week cycle taken from a great paper by Jake Schuster in Rugby Sevens. It's probably the best paper in Rugby Sevens that you will find, published a few years ago. And this was a proposed 3-week cycle in there. Now I've further modified this to make this 6 weeks, and it's in the Sweet Science of Fighting Underground. But I'm going to overlay me doing the first one set of the first week for you while I talk about this. But essentially 4 sets of 5 plus 5 plus 5, so 15 reps total in that set. You're going to rest 5 seconds between each cluster of 5 reps. Then you're going to rest 2 minutes between the sets. Then you're going to go to week 2. It's going to be 2 series. You're going to go 4 sets of 12 with 1 minute rest between those sets of 12. Then you're going to rest 2 minutes before you repeat those 4 sets of 12 again. So you're doing 4 sets of 12 in a block. Then you're resting 2 minutes. Then you're doing another block of 4 sets of 12. Then finally, week 3, you're going to do 4 sets of 10 with 30 seconds rest between. Then you're going to rest 1 minute between the series. So you're going to do 3 blocks of 4 sets of 10. That will absolutely kill you. So what you can do, if you want, is you can do less sets here and kind of break that out over the weeks to get you used to it. Same thing here. You could go into here and you can do less sets or series. Kind of break that out into the week, through the week, or you can start with more rest. Now, when are you looking to do high volume power training within your training cycle? There will be a couple of ways to go about this. First one, you could use it to peak. However, you need to be very careful with your training volume because this is so brutal. If you're sparring a lot, you're doing a lot of technical training, this could set you up for digging yourself into a hole, especially if you're cutting a lot of weight. However, if you can get everything dialed in, this is an excellent way to peak for a fight because, again, you're getting a lot of the maximal neuromuscular output, you're getting the cardiovascular output simultaneously. It lessens your total training load within that session. Your session will be quite short because when you're using something like this, you're not going to do a whole lot else within that session. You might do a little bit of upper body strength power before you start this. You'll do your set to this and you'll be done. You can also use this at the start of your fight camp, a little further away from the fight, but it gives you time to perform this when you're eating more food and you're only just starting to ramp up your technical training. One more time you could do this is when you're off season, potentially to plug gaps within your conditioning and your strength. You could do something like this as well. Now, bear in mind, if you do undergo high volume power training, you can do this 2 to 3 times a week. Your other conditioning is going to take a back seat. You don't want to overload yourself with too much training. If you enjoyed this video, down in the description, there's a link to the Sweet Science of Fighting Underground. It has all the training programs, including a high volume power training block, has the online courses, has the private Discord community with a bunch of coaches. It also gives you access to be live on the Sweet Science of Fighting podcast where you can ask questions at the end the members only Q&A. Further, there's a link to the article I wrote for us that goes into more detail as well of how you can implement the high volume power training within your own training.